While my wife, Victoria, was posing for local luxury magazines in our $2 million suburban colonial, showing off her so-called perfect life. My 68-year-old mother was sitting quietly in our kitchen, hiding dark purple bruises under her wool cardigan. Victoria thought she had permanently silenced a frail old woman. She actually believed her wealth and status made her untouchable. She did not know that beating my mother would be the exact catalyst that legally and financially erased her from existence. My name is Nolan. I am 38 years old, and this is how I turned my wife's perfect life into the nightmare she never saw coming. To understand how we reached that breaking point, you have to understand the nightmare I was already living. For the last 5 years, I existed as a ghost in my own marriage. I work as a county records clerk. It is a quiet, predictable job, organizing land deeds, municipal zoning permits, and historical property lines. I bring home about $45,000 a year. Victoria, on the other hand, is the most ruthless luxury real estate broker in the state. She clears over $1 million annually. She made sure I never forgot that financial gap for a single second. Our house, the cars, the furniture, every single thing was strictly in her name. It was a financial manipulation she set up right before our wedding, convincing me it was just for tax purposes. I was naive enough to believe her. Victoria and her older brother Preston ran our town like it was their personal monopoly board. Preston was a massive commercial property developer. He was the kind of guy who wore custom Italian suits, drove a matte black Porsche, and bragged about paying off city councilmen at the country club. Between Preston building the luxury subdivisions and Victoria selling them, they were untouchable. And they treated me like I was the hired help. Whenever Preston came over, he would toss me his car keys and tell me to make sure I did not scratch the rims. Victoria would just laugh, sipping her expensive wine, telling me I needed to develop a thicker skin. I swallowed my pride because I thought that was what a supportive husband did. I thought the money was just changing her, but the truth is, the money was just revealing who she really was. Things escalated from toxic to unbearable. 6 months ago, when my mother Clara suffered a mild stroke. Mom had always been a fiercely independent woman. She raised me single-handedly on a cashier's salary, sacrificing everything so I could have a decent life. But the stroke left her physically weak. Her left side was partially numb, her balance was shaky, and she could no longer live alone in her small apartment. I had no choice but to move her into the guest room of our sprawling colonial. Victoria hated it from day one. She did not see a sick woman needing care. She saw an inconvenience that ruined the aesthetic of her perfect home. Mom tried so hard to be invisible. She would spend all day in her room reading, she would scrub her own dishes despite her trembling hands, and she would constantly apologize for just existing. But Victoria made it a point to loudly complain about the smell of Mom's medication, the way she walked too slowly down the hallway, and the fact that her medical bills were a drain on the household budget. I felt completely emasculated. I was working overtime at the county office just to cover Mom's physical therapy, but I was still drowning. Victoria used that desperation as a weapon, reminding me daily that my mother was only surviving because of her charity. The real nightmare started on a Friday night in late October. Victoria was hosting a high-stakes dinner party. Preston was bringing 3 heavy-hitting investors from out of state. They were closing a massive deal for a new luxury subdivision, a project that Preston claimed would cement their legacy and bring in tens of millions of dollars. The entire week leading up to the dinner, Victoria was manic. She hired private caterers, brought in professional decorators, and ordered me to make sure my mother stayed out of sight. I told Victoria that Mom needed to eat dinner too. Victoria snapped back that she could eat a sandwich in her bedroom like a normal house guest. I refused. It was the first time in years I actually stood my ground. I told Victoria that my mother would sit at the table with us or I would pack our bags and leave. Victoria's eyes narrowed, cold and calculating. She agreed, but the smile she gave me sent a chill down my spine. She told me to make sure my mother did not embarrass her in front of the investors. The dinner party was suffocating. The dining room table was set with fine crystal and imported linens. Preston sat at the head of the table, holding court loudly, bragging about how he had outmaneuvered the local zoning board to secure the land for his new project. The investors, older men dripping with expensive cologne and arrogance, laughed at his crude jokes. Victoria played the perfect hostess, refilling glasses and charming the room. I sat quietly near the corner, cutting my food in silence. My mother sat next to me, her hands folded tightly in her lap, looking utterly terrified. She was wearing her best floral dress, but in a room full of Rolex watches and silk ties, she looked small and out of place. Halfway through the main course, Preston turned his attention to me. He asked how the thrilling world of filing dusty paperwork at the county clerk's office was going. The table chuckled. He told the investors that I was the family's resident librarian, a man who pushed paper, while real men pushed concrete. Victoria laughed louder than anyone. My mother reached under the table and squeezed my knee, a silent plea for me not to react. I swallowed my anger and gave a polite nod. As the caterers cleared the main course, my mother decided she wanted to help. She always hated feeling useless. Despite my whispered protests, she stood up on her shaky legs, picking up a few empty salad plates. I told her to sit down, that the staff would handle it, but she smiled nervously and took a step toward the kitchen. That was when her weak leg gave out. Mom stumbled forward. Her arm swung out to catch her balance and slammed directly into a newly opened $400 bottle of red wine sitting on the table. The heavy glass bottle tipped, rolled, and shattered against the floor. A massive wave of dark crimson wine splashed across the dining table, soaking the expensive linens and spilling violently onto Victoria's custom-made $10,000 Persian rug. The entire room went dead silent. The sound of the shattering glass seemed to echo off the high ceilings. My mother froze, staring at the spreading red stain, her hands trembling violently. She started crying immediately, apologizing over and over again, her voice cracking with pure terror. I jumped out of my chair, rushing to her side to make sure she was not cut by the glass. I looked up at Victoria. I expected her to explode. I expected her to scream. But she did not. Her face was a mask of absolute terrifying calm. She offered a tight, perfectly practiced smile to the investors. She calmly apologized for the interruption, assuring them it was just a minor accident. She asked Preston to take the guests into the drawing room for scotch and cigars while the staff cleaned up. Once the investors were out of the room, the temperature dropped. Victoria turned to me, her eyes dead and soulless. She told me in a whisper to go out to the detached garage and get the heavy-duty carpet cleaner and the industrial ice buckets. She said we needed to freeze the stain before it set. I hesitated, looking at my mother, who was still weeping, trying to pick up shards of glass with her bare hands. Victoria stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on my mother's shoulder. She told me to just go get the ice and that she would help Clara clean up the glass so she would not hurt herself. It sounded so reasonable. It sounded like she was finally showing an ounce of humanity. I foolishly believed her. I ran out the back door into the freezing night air. The detached garage was about 50 yards away from the main house. I fumbled in the dark for a few minutes, pulling the heavy carpet cleaner down from the top shelf. I grabbed a large plastic bucket and hurried back across the lawn. When I reached the back patio, I realized I had left the chemical solvent spray sitting on the garage workbench. I set the heavy machine down on the porch and quietly walked back inside the house to grab my keys from the kitchen counter. The kitchen was empty. The shattered glass was still on the dining room floor, but my mother and Victoria were nowhere to be seen. I walked silently across the hardwood floor, assuming they had gone to the downstairs bathroom to wash my mother's hands. But then I heard a muffled whimper coming from the large walk-in pantry. The pantry door was slightly ajar. Only a sliver of light spilled out into the dark hallway. I took a step closer, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. I reached out to push the door open, but the sound of Victoria's voice stopped me dead in my tracks. It was not her public voice. It was a vicious, venomous hiss. I peered through the crack in the door. The sight completely paralyzed me. Victoria had my frail 68-year-old mother backed into the corner of the pantry, pressed hard against the wooden shelving. Victoria's manicured hand was wrapped tightly around my mother's upper arm. She was gripping her so violently that I could see her fingernails digging deep into my mother's fragile skin, drawing small beads of blood. My mother was shrinking away, her eyes wide with sheer panic, tears streaming silently down her wrinkled cheeks. Victoria shoved my mother hard against the shelves. Cans of soup rattled violently. My mother let out a sharp gasp of pain, clutching her side where she hit the wood. Victoria leaned in so close that their faces were inches apart. She pointed a finger directly between my mother's eyes. "You listen to me, you worthless old parasite," Victoria whispered, every syllable dripping with pure hatred. "You ruined my rug. You embarrassed me in front of the only people who matter. I am sick of looking at your pathetic face, and I am sick of paying for your miserable existence." My mother sobbed, trying to pull her arm away, but Victoria yanked her back, tightening her grip until my mother let out another agonizing whimper. "I'm going to say this once," Victoria hissed, her teeth bared. "You are going to pack your cheap bags tomorrow. You are going to tell Nolan that you want to move into a state-assisted facility. If you do not, or if you tell him a single word about what is happening right now, I will personally guarantee that you end up in a ward so abusive and so dark that you will beg for death. I have the money. I have the lawyers. I will have you declared legally incompetent before breakfast." My mother shook her head, choking on her own tears. "Please," she begged, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, Victoria, he is my son." Victoria shoved her one last time, tossing her frail body aside like garbage. My mother stumbled and collapsed onto the hard tile floor, clutching her bruised arm against her chest. Victoria stood over her, straightening her expensive designer dress, completely devoid of empathy or guilt. She looked down at the woman who gave me life, the woman who sacrificed everything for me and delivered the final blow. "You say a word to him and I will put you in a state ward so fast your head will spin. No one will believe a senile old bat over me." Victoria turned toward the pantry door. I stepped back into the shadows of the hallway, my blood turning to absolute ice. The carpet cleaner, the spilled wine, the dinner party, it all vanished from my mind. In that single horrifying moment, the woman I had loved and defended for 5 years died. She was replaced by a monster. And as I stood there in the dark, listening to my mother quietly weeping on the cold pantry floor, a new kind of clarity washed over me. I did not walk into that pantry screaming. I did not throw a punch or tear the house apart. That would have given her exactly what she wanted. That would have allowed her to play the victim. Instead, I realized that standing up to a monster requires you to dismantle the very ground they stand on. Victoria thought her money made her a god. She thought her title and her brother's wealth gave her the right to physically assault a defenseless old woman in my own home. I took a deep breath, smoothing out my shirt. I turned around and walked back out the back door into the cold night air. I picked up the carpet cleaner. I stared at the bright lights of the $2 million house that Victoria held over my head every single day. She thought she had all the power. She thought I was just a quiet paper-pushing clerk with no spine. She forgot that the man who files the paperwork knows exactly where all the bodies are buried. She had just triggered a chain of events that would not stop until she lost her house, her career, her brother, and her freedom. The nightmare was only just beginning, and I was going to make sure she felt every single second of it. The heavy plastic ice bucket slipped from my frozen fingers. It hit the polished hardwood floor with a loud, violent crack, sending solid blocks of ice skittering across the hallway. The sudden sharp noise shattered the tense silence outside the pantry. Victoria whipped around. Her perfect, rigid posture stiffened, but the absolute cruelty in her eyes did not fade for a single second. She did not look like a wife who had just been caught in a moment of profound shame. She looked like an apex predator who was mildly annoyed by an unexpected interruption. I stepped forward into the dim light of the hallway. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely clench them into fists. I looked from the bleeding scratches on my mother's frail arm to the cold, dead expression on Victoria's face. All the years of biting my tongue, all the years of absorbing her subtle financial insults, all the years of feeling like a ghost in my own marriage evaporated right there on the spot. I told her to get her hands off my mother. My voice was low, but it trembled with a dark, heavy rage I had never experienced in my entire life. Victoria just sighed loudly. She let go of my mother, who immediately scrambled backward against the pantry shelves, breathing heavily and clutching her bruised arm. Victoria casually smoothed down the front of her expensive silk dress and looked at me like I was a muddy stain on her imported rug. She did not apologize. She did not try to explain away the violence I had just witnessed. Instead, she laughed. It was a sharp, mocking, humorless sound that echoed down the long corridor. She crossed her arms, tilted her head, and asked me what exactly I was going to do about it. She stepped closer, invading my space entirely, unafraid of the anger rolling off my shoulders. She looked me dead in the eye and told me I was a pathetic, paper-pushing loser. She reminded me with venom dripping from every word that my entire existence was subsidized by her real estate commissions. She said the food in my stomach, the clothes on my back, and the roof over my miserable head were all paid for by her long hours closing multi-million-dollar deals, while I sat in a dusty county basement stamping building permits for a pathetic $45,000 a year. She leaned in so close I could smell the expensive red wine on her breath. She whispered that I was barely half a man, and that bringing my parasitic crippled mother into her beautiful home was the final straw. She dared me to challenge her. She wanted me to know that in her luxurious world, I was nothing but an underpaid domestic employee she had accidentally married. I looked at the woman I had stood at the altar with 5 years ago, and I realized I did not know her at all. The ambition I had once admired was just a carefully constructed mask for pure, unadulterated malice. She viewed human beings as either financial assets or useless liabilities, and right now my mother and I were firmly in the liability column. I knelt down slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on Victoria, and gently helped my mother to her feet. Clara was shaking uncontrollably, her thin fingers digging desperately into my forearm. I saw the deep purple bruising already starting to bloom where Victoria had dug her acrylic nails into my mother's fragile skin. The sight of that dark bruise snapped the last thread of restraint holding me together. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I told Victoria that she had finally crossed the line. I told her I was calling the police and pressing felony charges for elder abuse. I promised her that the bruises on my mother's arm would be meticulously photographed, documented, and presented to a judge. I told her that the local luxury magazines she loved posing for would have an absolute field day printing her mugshot on their front covers. For a fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of genuine alarm flash across Victoria's eyes. The threat to her flawless public image and her lucrative real estate license was the only thing that could actually pierce her armor. But Victoria was a master manipulator. She survived in the cutthroat world of commercial development by always being 3 steps ahead of her opponents. She did not panic. She adapted. Before my thumb could even hit the dial pad, Victoria lunged toward the decorative console table in the hallway. She swiped her arm across the polished wood, sending a heavy, expensive porcelain vase crashing to the floor. It shattered into 100 jagged pieces. She then grabbed the collar of her own designer silk dress and ripped it downward with brutal force, tearing the fabric wide open. She ran her hands through her perfectly styled hair, messing it up wildly. Then she pulled her own phone from her pocket and immediately dialed 911. What happened next was an Oscar-worthy performance that completely terrified me. The second the emergency dispatcher answered, Victoria let out a blood-curdling scream. She began sobbing hysterically, her voice trembling with absolute raw terror. She cried into the receiver, begging the operator for help. She told them that her husband was having a violent psychological breakdown. She claimed I had just smashed a vase, cornered her in the hallway, and was actively threatening to kill her and her brother. She gasped for air, pleading with the dispatcher to send armed officers immediately because I was completely out of control and heavily agitated. She played the role of the battered, terrified wife so perfectly that if I had not been standing right there watching her orchestrate it, I would have believed the lie myself. I stood completely frozen, holding my phone, listening to my wife engineer my destruction in real time. My mother squeezed her eyes shut and buried her face against my chest. whimpering that she was sorry that it was all her fault and that she never meant to drop the wine. I told Mom it was going to be okay, but my voice lacked any real conviction. Victoria ended the emergency call and tossed her phone onto the hall table. The hysterical tears vanished instantly. Her face returned to that cold, calculating, victorious smirk. She looked at the torn fabric of her dress and the shattered porcelain on the floor, admiring her own theatrical handiwork. She whispered that the police were already on their way and that a lowly county clerk had absolutely no chance against a wealthy, terrified woman standing in a torn dress in her own home. The crashing noise from the hallway had drawn the attention of the dining room. Preston emerged from the drawing room holding a crystal glass of expensive scotch, trailed closely by the three wealthy investors. He took one look at the shattered vase, Victoria's torn dress, and my mother crying in my arms. Preston did not ask what happened. He did not need to. He knew exactly who his sister was, and he knew how to play the corporate survival game just as well as she did. Preston rushed forward, dropping his glass and pulling Victoria behind him in a grand protective stance. He shouted at me, demanding to know what I had done to his sister. The investors muttered among themselves, looking at me with absolute disgust. To them, the visual narrative was perfectly clear. I was the unhinged, lower-class husband, taking out my deep financial insecurities on my highly successful wife. I tried to speak. I tried to tell the wealthy men that Victoria had assaulted my mother. I pointed desperately to the fresh bruising on Clara's arm, but Preston raised his booming voice, drowning me out completely. He told the investors that I had been mentally unstable for months, that I was deeply resentful of Victoria's massive success, and that I had finally snapped under the pressure. Victoria buried her face in Preston's shoulder, weeping loudly for her captive audience. The investors nodded in sympathetic agreement. I was completely isolated in my own home, surrounded by powerful people who were actively writing a false narrative that would send me to a concrete cell. Less than 5 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of 2 police cruisers illuminated the large bay windows of the living room. 3 officers rushed through the front door, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. The moment they entered, Victoria unleashed another incredible wave of hysterical crying. She ran toward the lead officer, shaking violently, pointing a trembling finger at me. She repeated her fabricated lie, claiming I had gone into a sudden violent rage, destroyed the hallway, and threatened her life after a petty argument over my mother. Preston immediately backed her up. He introduced himself to the officers, making sure to casually mention his close personal friendship with the chief of police and the city council. He stated calmly and professionally that he had witnessed my aggressive behavior and stepped in to protect his terrified sister. The 3 investors stood in the background, serving as highly credible, wealthy witnesses to a violent crime that never actually happened. I tried to explain reality. I kept my voice incredibly steady, raising my hands to show I was absolutely not a threat. I told the lead officer that my wife was lying to him. I explained that I had caught Victoria physically assaulting my elderly mother in the pantry, and that Victoria had staged the broken vase and the torn dress to cover her tracks. I gently pulled up the sleeve of my mother's cardigan to show the police the fresh, bleeding nail marks and the deep purple bruising on her thin arm. The lead officer looked at the bruises. For a brief second, I thought the truth might actually matter. But Victoria was ready for it. She cried out, claiming that my mother had suffered a severe dizzy spell and fallen hard into the wooden pantry shelves. She said she had forcefully grabbed my mother's arm to stop her from hitting the tile floor, and that I was maliciously twisting a tragic medical accident into a vicious lie because I wanted her money. Preston chimed in smoothly, adding that my mother had recently suffered a stroke and was experiencing severe cognitive decline. He told the officers that Clara was easily confused and being manipulated by my erratic behavior. The officers looked closely at my mother. She was shaking, terrified, and completely unable to form a coherent sentence under the pressure. She looked exactly like what Preston had described, a frail, confused old woman. The lead officer turned his attention back to me. His eyes were hard and unsympathetic. He asked for my identification. Then he asked the most devastating legal question of the entire night. He asked whose name was on the deed to the property. my stomach completely hollowed out. Years ago, right before we got married, Victoria had convinced me to sign a quitclaim deed. She had a team of corporate accountants who claimed that keeping our primary residence solely in her name would protect our personal assets from potential liabilities in her high-stakes commercial real estate ventures. I had loved my wife. I had trusted her completely. I had signed the legal papers without a single second thought. Now, standing in the hallway with police officers glaring at me, that one piece of paper became the weapon that ended my life. Victoria sniffled, wiping away a fake tear, and told the officer that she was the sole legal owner of the property. The officer verified it through his dispatch radio. Once the dispatcher confirmed the deed was exclusively in Victoria's name, the dynamic in the room shifted instantly. The police were no longer dealing with a domestic dispute between two equal partners. They were dealing with a frightened homeowner and a hostile, unwanted occupant. The lead officer told me I had to leave the premises immediately. I argued, my voice finally cracking with real panic. I told them I lived here. I told them all my belongings were here. I told them my mother needed her specialized stroke medication that was sitting upstairs in the master bathroom. The officer placed his hand firmly on my chest, physically backing me toward the front door. He told me that Victoria was officially requesting an emergency protective order, and that if I did not walk out the front door voluntarily, I would be leaving the house in handcuffs. He said I could contact a lawyer in the morning to arrange a police escort to retrieve my belongings. But tonight, I was legally trespassing. The harsh reality of the situation crushed me like a physical weight. I had no leverage. I had no power. The law, the witnesses, and the property deed were all perfectly stacked against me. I turned to my mother. She was quietly weeping, clutching the fabric of her cardigan. I wrapped my arm around her frail shoulders and guided her toward the front door. The police officers walked closely behind us, treating us like dangerous criminals being escorted out of a secure facility. We stepped out onto the front porch. The freezing October rain was coming down in thick, relentless sheets. The cold wind cut straight through my thin dress shirt. I did not even have a jacket to protect myself. My mother was shivering violently, her small frame struggling against the bitter cold. I pulled her close, trying to shield her from the freezing rain with my own body. I turned back to look at the house one last time. The heavy oak front door was still open. Victoria was standing in the warm, brightly lit foyer. The fake tears were completely gone. The terrified victim routine had vanished the second the police turned their backs. She was holding a fresh glass of expensive red wine, taking a slow, deliberate sip. Preston stood right behind her, laughing quietly with the investors. Victoria looked straight into my eyes through the pouring rain. She raised her wine glass just a fraction of an inch. It was a silent, mocking toast to my absolute destruction. Then she reached out and slammed the heavy door shut, locking the deadbolt with a loud final click. I stood in the freezing rain on the driveway of a $2 million house I had helped maintain for 5 years. I held my shivering, bruised mother in my arms. I had no car keys, no coat, and no home. Victoria had stripped me of my dignity, my security, and my reputation in less than an hour. She had used her wealth and her status to rewrite reality, turning herself into a victim and turning me into a monster. She believed she had won the ultimate victory. She actually believed she had discarded a useless husband and a burdensome old woman without suffering a single consequence. But as I guided my mother down the long manicured driveway toward the dark, rain-soaked street, the despair inside me began to harden into something else entirely. It was not blind, chaotic rage. It was a cold, calculated, absolute certainty. Victoria thought she had buried me tonight. She did not realize she had just handed me the shovel. She had drawn the battle lines, and she had shown me exactly how ruthlessly she played the game. I was going to let her enjoy her warm house and her expensive wine for a little while longer, because the higher she climbed on her mountain of lies, the harder the fall was going to be when I pulled the earth right out from under her feet. The harsh fluorescent lights of the 24-hour diner buzzed relentlessly overhead. We had spent the entire night huddled in a sticky vinyl booth at the edge of the city. My mother slept fitfully, her head resting on her folded arms against the scratched formica table, still wearing the damp floral dress from the dinner party. I had stayed awake every single second, staring out the rain-streaked window into the black parking lot, trying to map out a survival plan. I told myself things would look clearer in the morning. I told myself I still had my salary, our joint savings, and my car. I was incredibly wrong. At 6 a.m, the tired waitress with a stained apron dropped a check on our table for 2 black coffees. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and opened my banking application to transfer funds from savings to my checking account. I stared at the screen. I refreshed the application. I closed it completely and opened it again. The balance displayed was $0.00. A sickening wave of panic hit my chest. I tapped into the transaction history. At exactly 2 a.m, an electronic wire transfer had completely drained $42,000 from our joint accounts. Victoria had liquidated every single penny we had saved over the last 5 years and moved it into a private offshore trust under her exclusive name. Before I could even process the theft, a heavy knock tapped against the diner window. 2 uniformed sheriff deputies were standing on the wet pavement outside looking directly at me. My heart hammered against my ribs as I walked out the glass doors to meet them. They did not ask how I was doing. They handed me a thick manila envelope and stepped back. It was an emergency ex parte restraining order. Victoria had woken up a sympathetic district judge in the middle of the night using the fabricated police report from the dinner party as evidence. The document explicitly legally barred me from coming within 500 feet of Victoria, her brother, the $2 million suburban house, and inexplicably my own sedan, which she claimed she needed for her personal safety. If I tried to access my own vehicle or step foot on my own driveway, I would be arrested on sight for violating a court order. I walked back into the diner feeling like I was suffocating. I had absolutely nothing. I scraped together the crumpled single-dollar bills and loose quarters from the bottom of my slacks just to pay the waitress for the coffee. I helped my mother out of the booth, guiding her fragile steps toward the transit stop down the street. I told her we were going to my office at the county courthouse. I reasoned that if I could just get to my desk, I could ask for a payroll advance. I had worked for the county for a decade without a single infraction. I believed my professional reputation would be the one thing Victoria could not touch. The heavy glass doors of the county records department offered a brief moment of warmth against the freezing October morning. I settled my mother into a chair in the quiet lobby, wrapping my damp suit jacket around her shivering shoulders. I walked toward the clerk bullpen, desperately hoping to find my supervisor. Instead, the director of human resources was standing at my desk accompanied by 2 armed courthouse security guards. The moment he saw me, his expression tightened with a mixture of pity and severe discomfort. He asked me to step into the private conference room immediately. The room was perfectly silent, smelling of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner. The human resources director did not offer me a seat. He folded his hands on the table and explained that his office had received a highly concerning phone call less than an hour ago. The call did not come from Victoria. It came directly from the county commissioner, a man who happened to share a private country club membership and a weekly golf schedule with Preston. Preston had painted a vivid, horrifying picture for his powerful friend. He claimed I was suffering from a violent, unpredictable mental breakdown, that I had brutally attacked my wife, and that the local police had to forcibly remove me from my residence. Preston insisted that allowing me access to sensitive county property records while in such a dangerous psychological state was a massive liability for the city. I tried to defend myself. I raised my voice, begging the director to look at my flawless 10-year service record. I explained that I was the victim of a malicious smear campaign, that my wife and her brother were weaponizing the legal system to strip me of my rights. The director simply shook his head, refusing to meet my eyes. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was an official notice of indefinite unpaid administrative leave. He stated that until a full police investigation cleared my name of all domestic violence allegations, I was strictly forbidden from entering any county building. The two security guards stepped forward, placing their hands near their radios, signaling that the conversation was permanently over. They escorted me down the main hallway past my coworkers who stared at me with wide eyes and hushed whispers. The humiliation was absolute and consuming. I had spent 10 years organizing the history of this county, building a reputation as a quiet, reliable man. Preston and Victoria had completely incinerated that reputation with a single casual phone call between golf buddies. I gathered my mother from the lobby under the watchful gaze of the armed guards and walked back out into the brutal, relentless rain. We stood under the rusted metal awning of a bus stop completely abandoned by the world. I had no bank account, no home, no vehicle, and now no source of income. The legal and financial ambush was a perfectly executed masterpiece of cruelty. Victoria had methodically severed every single lifeline I possessed, ensuring that I would have absolutely no resources to fight her in court. I looked at my mother. Her lips were pale, her hands were trembling violently, and her breathing was shallow. She needed a warm bed, a hot meal, and her medication. I had absolutely no way to provide any of those things. The sheer weight of my failure pressed down on my chest until I could barely draw breath. My mother reached out with her bruised, trembling hand and grabbed my wrist. Her voice was weak, barely cutting through the sound of the pouring rain hitting the pavement. She told me about the old farmhouse. It was a piece of property her grandfather had purchased nearly a century ago. It sat on a barren 10-acre lot miles outside the city limits, completely forgotten by the modern world. My mother had inherited the deed decades ago, but had never possessed the money to renovate or maintain the structure. It was just an address on a piece of paper, a decaying relic from a past she rarely spoke about. But right now it was the only piece of shelter on the entire planet that did not belong to Victoria. I counted the last few coins in my pocket. It was exactly enough for 2 one-way tickets on the outbound regional bus. The ride took over an hour, carrying us far away from the manicured lawns and luxury developments of our former life. The bus dropped us off on the shoulder of a cracked, desolate highway surrounded by overgrown weeds and dead trees. The wind howled across the open plains, biting through our wet clothes. We walked slowly down a muddy, rutted driveway, my mother leaning heavily against my side with every painful step. When the farmhouse finally came into view, my heart plummeted straight into my stomach. The word dilapidated did not even begin to describe the absolute ruin standing before us. The structure looked like a discarded skeleton. The wooden porch was severely warped and sagging under the weight of decades of neglect. Half of the shingles had been ripped away by countless storms, exposing the rotting timber underneath. The windows were either shattered completely or boarded up with decaying plywood. The entire 10-acre lot was a wasteland of dead grass, rusted farm equipment, and creeping briars. It was a monument to decay and forgotten history. I pushed the heavy splintered front door open. The hinges screamed in protest, a harsh metallic grating noise that echoed into the empty woods. The interior of the house was a nightmare of shadows and freezing drafts. The smell of damp earth, black mold, and rotting wood hit me instantly, thick and suffocating. There was no electricity, no running water, and absolutely no heat. The floorboards groaned ominously under my boots, feeling soft and spongy from years of water damage. A massive, dark stain spread across the living room ceiling where rain had been leaking through the roof for years, dripping steadily onto the warped floor. I guided my mother to an old, dust-covered wooden chair in the corner of the room. It was the only piece of furniture that looked sturdy enough to hold her weight. She sat down, slowly pulling her thin cardigan tight across her chest, shivering so violently that her teeth chattered. I stood in the center of the ruined freezing room, listening to the wind whistle through the broken windows. The stark, undeniable reality of our situation crashed down on me with terrifying force. This was my entire world now. This rotting, forgotten shack was the culmination of my life. I had followed all the rules. I had worked hard, paid my taxes, supported my wife, and tried to be a decent, honorable man. My reward for a lifetime of quiet obedience was standing in a freezing, decaying room with absolutely nothing to my name, watching the woman who sacrificed everything to raise me slowly freeze to death. The stoic composure I had desperately maintained since the dinner party finally shattered. My knees buckled and I dropped to the damp, rotting floorboards. I buried my face in my cold hands, and the tears I had fought back all morning finally spilled over. I wept with a deep, agonizing, chest-heaving sorrow. I wept for the dignity Victoria had stolen from me, for the career Preston had effortlessly destroyed, and mostly for the profound, overwhelming guilt I felt toward my mother. I looked up at her through blurred vision. She was sitting in the freezing dark, bruised, exhausted, and abandoned by society. I told her I was sorry. I apologized over and over again, my voice echoing hollowly against the peeling wallpaper. I told her I had failed her as a son, that I was supposed to protect her, and that I had dragged her down into my own miserable destruction. I felt like the absolute pathetic loser Victoria always claimed I was. I believed in that agonizing moment that the monsters had permanently won, and that this ruined, freezing farmhouse would be the place where we simply faded out of existence. The bitter chill of the morning crept through the cracked windows long before the sun finally breached the horizon. I sat on the warped wooden floor of the living room, my back pressed against the peeling wallpaper, listening to the relentless wind rattle the decaying frame of the house. Every breath I took materialized as a white cloud in the freezing air. My mother had finally drifted into a restless, shivering sleep in the dust-covered chair across from me. I had spent the entire night turning over every possible scenario in my mind, searching for a single loophole, a single lifeline to pull us out of this nightmare. I had nothing. Victoria had orchestrated a flawless execution. She had taken my finances, my home, my career, and my reputation. We were marooned on a barren 10-acre lot with absolutely zero resources. The sound of tires crunching heavily over the muddy, rutted driveway broke the silence. I pushed myself up from the floor, my joints stiff and aching from the cold. I looked through the broken glass of the front window. A sleek black luxury sedan was idling next to the overgrown briar bushes. The contrast between the pristine vehicle and the rotting farmhouse was jarring. A man in a sharp charcoal suit stepped out of the driver's side, carefully sidestepping a deep puddle of muddy water. He carried a thick, sealed manila envelope. He did not look like a lost traveler. He looked like a corporate assassin. I opened the heavy front door and stepped out onto the sagging porch. The man walked up the steps, his expression entirely blank, completely unaffected by the freezing wind or the absolute misery radiating from the house. He asked if I was Nolan. I gave a slow, hesitant nod. He thrust the thick envelope against my chest, turned on his heel, and walked back to his luxury car without uttering a single additional word. The sedan reversed down the driveway and vanished onto the highway, leaving me standing alone with a heavy block of dread forming in my stomach. I ripped the envelope open. My numb fingers fumbled with the thick stack of premium legal paper inside. The letterhead belonged to one of the most ruthless, high-priced litigation firms in the state, the exact firm Preston kept on a massive retainer for his commercial development projects. I began to read the documents, and with every single line my eyes processed, the remaining air was violently sucked out of my lungs. Victoria was not just satisfied with kicking us out into the cold. She was actively moving to eradicate our existence. The paperwork was a formal petition for an emergency medical conservatorship. Victoria was legally filing to become my mother's sole guardian, claiming that Clara was suffering from severe advanced cognitive decline and could no longer care for herself. To justify this hostile takeover, Victoria had attached the fabricated police report from the dinner party. Her high-powered lawyers had spun a terrifying narrative. They argued that my unpaid administrative leave from the county and my supposed violent domestic outburst proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was a financially destitute, psychologically unstable danger to a fragile senior citizen. I read the next page, and the sheer calculated malice of Victoria's plan made my vision blur. If the judge granted the conservatorship, Victoria had already outlined her immediate course of action. She would forcibly remove Clara from my care and place her in a state-funded low-income medical ward on the opposite side of the county. I knew exactly what kind of facility they were referencing. It was a bleak, understaffed warehouse for the forgotten, a place where elderly patients were heavily medicated, strapped to beds, and left to fade away in dark rooms. It was a death sentence for a woman recovering from a stroke. But Victoria's cruelty did not stop there. The petition included a financial addendum. Victoria argued that in order to cover the exorbitant legal fees required to secure this conservatorship, the court should grant her the authority to seize and liquidate Clara's remaining assets. That meant this decaying, forgotten farmhouse. Victoria wanted to take the very last piece of dirt my mother owned, sell it for pennies, and use the money to pay the lawyers who were destroying us. I flipped to the final page. It was a mandatory notice to appear. The hearing was scheduled for Monday morning at the county courthouse. I had exactly 72 hours to respond. 72 hours. I dropped the thick stack of papers onto the rotting porch boards. Because I worked in the county records department, I knew exactly how the legal system functioned. I knew that when a high-priced attorney walked into a courtroom representing a wealthy, successful real estate broker and handed a judge a police report detailing domestic instability, the judge would rubber stamp the conservatorship without a second thought. I could not afford a lawyer to defend us. I could not even afford a warm cup of coffee. Victoria had boxed me into a flawless, inescapable corner. I walked back inside the house, shutting the wind out behind me. I slid down the wall and put my head in my hands. The fight completely drained out of me. I felt a crushing absolute defeat. I had tried so hard to play by the rules my entire life, but the rules only applied to people who could not afford to buy the game. Victoria and Preston were going to win. They were going to throw my mother into a living nightmare, and I was entirely powerless to stop it. I heard a soft rustling of fabric. I looked up. My mother was awake. She was sitting straight up in the old wooden chair. The violent shivering that had plagued her all night had completely stopped. I braced myself, expecting her to ask what was wrong, expecting the panic to return to her eyes. I picked up the legal papers from the floor, trying to figure out how to explain that we had 3 days before the state arrived to take her away. I told her I was sorry. My voice cracked in the freezing room. I told her Victoria was coming for the property that she was filing for conservatorship, and that I had absolutely no money to fight back. I confessed my total failure as a son. Clara did not cry. The fear and the confusion that had clouded her expression since the stroke seemed to evaporate into the freezing air. A sudden sharp clarity settled over her wrinkled features. She looked around the ruined, decaying living room, her eyes tracing the water stains on the ceiling and the rotting timber of the walls. She did not see a ruined shack. She saw something I could not comprehend. She looked directly at me. Her voice was no longer the fragile, trembling whisper of a frightened old woman. It was steady. It carried the heavy, unmistakable weight of absolute authority. They only look at the dirt, Nolan. They never look at the roots. I stared at her, completely confused. I asked her what she was talking about. My mother slowly pushed herself up from the chair. She ignored her weak left leg, standing taller than she had in months. She pointed toward the center of the house, specifically at a massive rusted cast-iron stove that sat anchored into the floorboards. It was an ancient relic from the late 1800s, so heavy that the floor beneath it had bowed slightly over the decades. She told me her grandfather did not build this farmhouse just to have a place to sleep. She explained that he was a man who understood the fundamental greed of the world. He knew that titles, cash, and luxury were fleeting illusions that could be stripped away by banks or the government. He believed that true power was quiet. True power was absolute, unshakable ownership. And he knew that one day, long after he was gone, someone in his bloodline would be backed into a corner by monsters who thought they held all the cards. She ordered me to go out to the overgrown barn behind the house and find a pry bar. She told me to rip up the floorboards directly underneath the iron stove. I did not question her. The fierce determination radiating from her frail body propelled me into action. I ran out the back door, fighting my way through the thick frozen briar patches until I reached the collapsed remains of the old barn. The roof had completely caved in, but I dug through the debris with my bare hands until I found a heavy, rusted iron crowbar buried under a pile of rotted wood. I sprinted back into the house, my lungs burning from the freezing air. I knelt down next to the massive cast-iron stove. The oak floorboards beneath it were ancient, secured by thick, square-cut iron nails that had oxidized into the wood. I wedged the sharp end of the crowbar into the tight seam between the planks and threw my entire body weight into the iron handle. The wood groaned a loud, violent sound of resistance. I pulled harder, ignoring the sharp splinters biting into my palms. The rusted nails finally shrieked and gave way, sending a cloud of century-old dust exploding into the air. I tore away 3 heavy planks, exposing the dark, damp earth beneath the foundation of the house. I grabbed the flashlight from my pocket and shined the beam into the narrow cavity. Sitting in the dry dirt, perfectly preserved beneath the massive weight of the iron stove, was a large metal lockbox. It was a heavy utilitarian container from the Great Depression era, completely covered in a thick layer of rust and oxidized steel. It looked like it weighed 50 pounds. My heart hammered aggressively against my ribs. My mind instantly raced with desperate, wild hope. I thought about the legal fees. I thought about buying a lawyer to fight Victoria. If my great-grandfather had hidden money, gold, or Depression-era cash down here, it would be the exact miracle we needed to survive the next 72 hours. I grabbed the thick metal handle of the lockbox and heaved it upward. My muscles strained as I pulled it out of the dirt cavity and dragged it onto the living room floor. The heavy metal scraped loudly against the wood. The lock on the front of the box had completely rusted through decades ago. I grabbed the crowbar, wedged it under the heavy steel lid, and snapped the latch open with a sharp, forceful twist. I pushed the heavy lid back. I braced myself for the sight of bundled cash or valuable heirlooms. Instead, an overwhelming wave of disappointment washed over me. There was no money. There was no gold. There was nothing inside that could be immediately pawned or handed to a defense attorney. The box was filled with paper. I dropped the crowbar, my shoulders slumping in absolute defeat. I reached into the metal container and pulled out the contents. It was a thick stack of incredibly fragile, yellowed legal ledgers. The edges of the paper were brittle, bound together by heavy leather covers that had stiffened over the past century. Sitting on top of the ledgers was a solid, heavy brass cylinder. I picked it up. It was an antique wax seal stamp, the kind used in the early 1900s to authenticate official municipal documents and finalize land grants. The initials of my great-grandfather were deeply engraved into the bottom of the brass. I looked up at my mother. The desperation returned to my chest. I told her it was just old books. I told her there was no money in the box and that antique ledgers were not going to stop Victoria's lawyers from dragging us into court on Monday morning. I said we needed cash, not history. Clara walked slowly across the room. She looked down at the rusted metal box, and then she looked at me. Her expression did not waver. The clarity in her eyes only sharpened. She told me that Victoria and Preston built their entire lives on top of shiny, expensive illusions. They sold luxury to people who wanted to feel important. But she reminded me of who I was. She reminded me that I spent 10 years sitting in the basement of the county courthouse analyzing the very foundation of the city. I knew how to trace a property line through 100 years of municipal red tape. I knew how to read the fine print that powerful developers always ignored. She pointed to the yellowed, brittle ledgers resting in my hands. She told me her grandfather did not hide money because money could be stolen, spent, or frozen by a bank. He hid the ground. She told me to open the books. She told me to stop looking at the dirt and start reading the roots. I wiped the heavy dust from the cover of the first leather-bound ledger. I opened the brittle pages, carefully separating the ancient paper. The handwriting was sharp, meticulous, and filled with dense municipal zoning codes from the 1920s. As a county records clerk, this was my exact native language. I did not need a translator to understand the legal framework of land deeds. I began to read the first page. The freezing temperature of the ruined farmhouse suddenly faded away. The hunger in my stomach vanished. The absolute crushing despair that had paralyzed me all morning was instantly replaced by a shockwave of adrenaline so powerful it made my hands shake. I stared at the faded ink, my eyes tracing the specific coordinates, the legally binding terms, and the undeniable brass seal stamped at the bottom of the page. I realized in that exact moment that the rusty, forgotten metal box did not contain survival money. It contained the ultimate catastrophic weapon. It contained the exact legal mechanism required to completely annihilate Victoria and her brother from the face of the earth. The freezing air inside the ruined farmhouse was thick with the smell of black mold and rotting timber, but I could no longer feel the bitter cold biting at my skin. I sat cross-legged on the warped, damp floorboards, pulling a battery-powered camping lantern closer to my knees. Its harsh white light cast long, dancing shadows against the peeling wallpaper, illuminating the sprawling, cursive script across the first yellowed page of the heavy leather ledger. For the past 5 years, Victoria had relentlessly mocked my profession. She called me a glorified librarian, a pathetic man who wasted his life buried in a windowless county basement sorting dead paper while she made millions building the future. She never understood that the future was always built directly on top of the past. As a senior county records clerk, my entire professional existence revolved around untangling the complex, archaic webs of American property law. I spent 40 hours a week translating illegible 19th century surveyor notes, mapping forgotten riparian rights, and tracking the unbroken chain of title for thousands of municipal parcels. To the average person, the densely packed black ink on these fragile pages would look like a meaningless diary of crop yields and forgotten boundary disputes. To me, it was a perfectly constructed legal map. I traced my thumb over the heavy ink, reading the precise, methodical handwriting of my great-grandfather Harrison. He was a resilient man who lived through the brutal economic crashes of the early 20th century, and he clearly possessed a mind built for survival. The first few pages of the ledger were standard agricultural records from the early 1920s. I read through mundane purchases of seed timber sales and property tax receipts for the 10-acre plot where this decaying farmhouse currently stood. But as I carefully turned the brittle pages, moving deeper into the brutal winter of 1924, the nature of the entries shifted completely. The agricultural logs transformed into dense, heavily notarized legal contracts. My mother sat quietly in the dark corner of the room, her silhouette barely visible outside the glow of the lantern. Her violent shivering had finally stopped, and her breathing was completely steady. The sheer panic of being evicted into the rain had been replaced by a profound, haunting patience. She watched me silently, knowing exactly what I was trained to do. I pulled the lantern closer, squinting at a specific multi-page entry dated October 12, 1924. My heart began to beat with a slow, heavy, aggressive rhythm against my ribs. Harrison had not just been a poor dirt farmer. He had been a visionary who fully understood the inevitable outward expansion of the city limits. The 10-acre plot with the farmhouse was completely irrelevant in the grand scheme of his portfolio. It was just a small anchor, a tiny decoy parcel. According to the meticulously recorded surveyor coordinates and the attached carbon copy of a municipal land deed, Harrison had quietly purchased an additional 500 acres of adjoining undeveloped pasture and dense woodland directly east of the farmhouse. But he did not farm those 500 acres, and he absolutely never sold them to anyone. Instead, anticipating that the local government would eventually need vast amounts of space for municipal infrastructure, Harrison executed a commercial ground lease. I stared at the handwritten words, reading the legal phrasing 3 times to ensure my exhausted, freezing brain was not hallucinating the details. A commercial ground lease is a highly specific, ironclad real estate mechanism. It means the legal landowner rents the physical dirt itself to a tenant for a set period of time, usually 50 or 99 years. The tenant is granted the right to grade the land, pave roads, and build whatever massive structures they want on top of that dirt. But the absolute most critical rule of American real estate law dictates that when a ground lease eventually expires, every single permanent structure, every paved road, every building, and every utility pipe buried in the soil legally reverts back to the original landowner, completely free and clear of any encumbrances. It is the ultimate generational long game, a financial time bomb designed to enrich the descendants of the man who signed the paper. I carefully unfolded a highly fragile tissue paper surveyor map tucked between the pages of the ledger. The blue ink was severely faded, but the topographical lines were undeniable. Harrison had leased the 500 adjoining acres to the county for exactly 100 years. The original recorded intent was for a massive municipal reservoir that was never actually constructed. The vast acreage had just sat there, passed around from one bureaucratic city department to another, entirely forgotten in the bottomless archives of city planning. Over the decades, the specific leasehold nature of the land had been lost in a sea of digitized municipal records, lazy bureaucratic audits, and administrative turnover. The city government had simply begun treating the massive expanse of land as their own sovereign fee, simple property completely ignoring the fine print of a covenant signed long before the Great Depression. My hands were shaking so violently that I had to place the brittle tissue paper map flat against the floorboards to keep from accidentally tearing it. The breadcrumbs were all there, laid out with absolute surgical precision. The heavy brass wax seal stamped at the bottom of the contract proved the document was not just a theoretical draft. It was the original, fully executed master copy. My family owned 500 acres of prime real estate sitting right on the edge of the city limits. But I needed to verify the modern boundaries. I needed to see exactly what sat on those 500 acres today, and I needed to confirm that the county had not somehow seized the land through eminent domain. I pulled my cell phone from my damp pocket. The screen lit up with a harsh glare, immediately displaying a low battery warning. I had exactly 9% remaining. The cellular signal out here on the desolate edge of the county was incredibly weak, fluctuating dangerously between 1 and 2 bars. I took a deep breath, trying desperately to steady my racing pulse, and opened the web browser. I bypassed the standard public search engines and logged directly into the county's restricted geographic information system portal using my active employee administrative credentials. The mapping system was notoriously heavy and slow on the best of days, and on my dying phone, the digital loading bar crawled at an agonizing, torturous pace. The small spinning circle on the screen felt like an eternity. The cold wind howled against the side of the farmhouse, threatening to shatter the last remaining window pane. My phone battery dipped to 7%. Finally, the screen populated with the digital topographical map of the entire county. I frantically zoomed in on the northwestern perimeter, dragging my thumb across the glass, bypassing the dense commercial districts and the sprawling wealthy suburbs. I pulled the focus directly onto our current location in the barren fields. I easily found the small, isolated, triangular shape of the 10-acre farmhouse lot. The system officially registered it under my mother's maiden name, proving the database was actively updating. Then, using my great-grandfather's handwritten surveyor coordinates from the 1924 ledger, I virtually traced the boundaries of the 500-acre commercial ground lease. I drew the digital perimeter line by line, mapping the exact historical footprint of the leased dirt across the modern municipal grid. The battery indicator flashed red, dropping to 5%. I tapped the screen to finalize the boundary lines and requested the system to generate the modern satellite overlay. The blank parcel grids faded into view, replacing the solid colors with high-resolution real-time aerial photography. I stared at the illuminated screen of my phone. All the oxygen instantly evaporated from the ruined living room. I stopped breathing entirely. I wiped my eyes with the back of my trembling hand, truly thinking the sheer exhaustion, the lack of food, and the freezing cold were playing severe psychological tricks on my vision. But when I opened my eyes and looked down again, the satellite image did not change. The 500 acres of leased land sitting directly adjacent to the farmhouse was not an empty, overgrown pasture. It was not a municipal reservoir, a forgotten county park, or a protected wildlife reserve. It was an enormous, sprawling, freshly paved luxury residential development. It was Oakwood Heights, My mind violently reeled as the sheer catastrophic magnitude of the discovery crashed down on me. Oakwood Heights was Victoria and Preston's absolute crown jewel. It was the $150 million residential mega project they had spent the last 3 years developing, grading, building, and aggressively pre-selling to out-of-state investors and wealthy local elites. I held the phone closer to my face, my eyes darting frantically back and forth between the digital screen and the century-old tissue paper map. I matched the curving, pristine suburban streets, the massive custom-built clubhouse, and the sprawling luxury mansions on the satellite image directly to the boundaries of my great-grandfather's lease. The footprint was absolutely flawlessly identical. Not a single mansion sat outside the lines of Harrison's dirt. The realization of how this happened hit me with absolute clarity. Preston was a famously corrupt, arrogant developer who regularly bragged about cutting red tape to save time and money. His cheap title company had clearly taken dangerous shortcuts. They had bypassed the deep historical archives, assumed the city owned the land outright due to decades of municipal tax exemptions, and purchased the massive tract from the local government under a false, severely broken chain of title. Preston had greased the right palms at the zoning board to expedite the sale completely, ignoring the archaic deed restrictions buried in the basement archives. They had poured tens of millions of dollars of investor capital into destroying the old pasture, grading the land, laying miles of expensive subterranean utility pipes, and constructing 200 sprawling multi-million-dollar luxury homes. Victoria had personally secured millions of dollars in advance commissions by selling these properties as exclusive gated estates to her ultra-wealthy clientele. They had built their entire untouchable kingdom directly on top of dirt they did not legally own. And the most devastating, beautiful piece of the entire puzzle was the date. I looked down at the ledger, checking the exact day my great-grandfather had executed the 100-year ground lease. It was October 12th, 1924. I looked at the digital calendar on my dying phone screen. Today was October 16th. The 100-year commercial ground lease had officially expired exactly 4 days ago. Under the strict, unforgiving terms of American real estate law, the county no longer possessed a leasehold interest in the property. Preston's fraudulent purchase of the land was completely null and void, which meant that every single permanent structure built on those 500 acres now legally reverted back to the original fee simple landowner. Victoria and Preston did not own Oakwood Heights. They did not own the luxury country club, the paved roads, or the 200 custom-built mansions. I owned them. My mother owned them. I lowered the phone and looked across the freezing dark room at the frail, bruised woman sitting in the shadows. Victoria had physically assaulted my mother, thrown us out into the freezing rain, and filed legal papers to have Clara locked away in a state-funded nightmare facility just so she could sell this 10-acre farmhouse to cover her legal fees. She had called me a pathetic paper-pushing loser who would never amount to anything. She had done all of this while standing in a $2 million house paid for by commissions she earned selling my family's stolen property. I gently placed the heavy brass wax seal back into the rusted lockbox alongside the ledgers. The profound sense of helplessness that had suffocated me for the past 12 hours was entirely gone. It was replaced by a cold, sharp, predatory focus. Victoria had given me 72 hours to respond to her legal threats. She expected me to crawl into the courtroom on Monday morning, broke, defeated, and begging for mercy. She had absolutely no idea that I was holding the deed to her entire existence. She had no idea that I was about to legally, systematically, and ruthlessly erase her from the wealthy society she worshipped. The game was no longer about simple survival. It was about absolute annihilation, and I was going to make sure she felt the ground crumble beneath her feet before she even knew she was falling. I sat completely paralyzed on the rotting floorboards of the farmhouse, my eyes burning from the harsh glare of my dying phone screen. The digital map was absolute and irrefutable. The bright blue perimeter lines of my great-grandfather's lease perfectly traced the exact boundaries of Oakwood Heights. It was an exact, flawless match. My freezing hands gripped the yellowed pages of the ancient ledger, and a rush of pure, unadulterated adrenaline flooded my veins. For the first time in my entire life, I was holding a weapon that Victoria and Preston could not buy, intimidate, or destroy. My mind instantly went to work, shifting from the shock of the discovery into the clinical, analytical precision of a senior records clerk. I needed to understand exactly how a $150 million luxury subdivision had been built on stolen dirt. How does an empire of that magnitude get constructed without anyone realizing the foundational land deed was completely invalid? As a man who had spent a decade archiving the convoluted history of county property lines, the answer presented itself with crystal clarity. It was a spectacular, catastrophic combination of bureaucratic laziness and arrogant hubris. Preston was a developer who operated entirely on a golf course mentality. He did not care about historical accuracy. He cared about speed, profit, and optics. When he initially scouted the 500 acres for his mega project 3 years ago, he saw an incredibly massive undeveloped tract of land sitting right on the edge of the lucrative city limits. He hired a cut-rate discount title insurance company to run the property check. Those cheap title researchers took the easiest possible route. They pulled the surface-level digital records, saw an 80-year-old municipal tax exemption filed by the City Parks Department, and lazily assumed the local government owned the parcel in perpetuity. They never bothered to dig past the digital surface. They never went down into the physical basement vaults of the courthouse to cross-reference the original 1924 paper deeds. They saw empty land, assumed it was unencumbered city property, and Preston immediately began greasing the right palms. He leveraged his deep connections with the county commissioner, pushed through expedited zoning variances, and purchased the massive tract from the local government under a false, severely broken chain of title. The city sold him a piece of land they only held a temporary lease on, and Preston was far too arrogant to read the fine print. He had poured tens of millions of dollars of investor capital into destroying the old pasture, grading the earth, laying miles of expensive subterranean utility pipes, and pouring the concrete foundations for 200 sprawling luxury estates. Preston had built an entire kingdom on top of a ticking legal time bomb, and his own catastrophic arrogance had completely blinded him to the fuse. I traced my trembling finger over the meticulous, looping, cursive handwriting of my great-grandfather. Harrison was a man who understood that true wealth was not measured in luxury cars or tailored suits, but in patience. He had engineered a commercial ground lease that was an absolute masterpiece of generational warfare. I read the specific reversionary clauses inked into the heavy parchment. The legal language was unforgiving, absolute, and undeniably beautiful. The contract explicitly dictated that upon the exact termination of the 100-year term, all rights, titles, interests, and physical improvements attached to the soil would revert instantly and completely to the original grantor or their direct living heirs. In standard residential real estate, a house and the land it sits on are treated as a single entity, but a commercial ground lease operates in a completely different dimension of the law. When you lease the dirt, you only own the illusion of permanence. You can build a skyscraper, you can pave a highway, you can construct a sprawling luxury country club, but the absolute second that lease expires, every single permanent fixture permanently belongs to the person who owns the dirt. There is no grace period. There is no mandatory buyout clause. There is no negotiation required. The law views the physical structures as permanent attachments to the earth, and the earth always demands its due. I looked at the specific date written at the top of the lease. My great-grandfather had executed this ironclad agreement on October 12, 1924. I looked at the digital calendar displaying on my phone screen. Today was Wednesday, October 16, 2024. The air left my lungs in a sharp, sudden gasp. The 100-year commercial ground lease had officially expired exactly 4 days ago. 4 days ago. The timing was so completely perfect, it felt like absolute divine intervention. The dinner party where Victoria had brutally assaulted my mother the night she had mocked my entire existence and thrown us out into the pouring rain had taken place on a Friday. The ground lease had silently and legally expired on the Thursday right before it. If Preston had actually done his basic due diligence, if he had hired competent lawyers instead of relying on local corruption, he might have discovered this lease a year ago. He could have filed a massive municipal lawsuit, forced a quiet title action, or attempted to buy me out for a fraction of the land's actual worth. He had the resources to bury me in endless corporate litigation while the lease was still actively in effect, but he did not. Preston was too busy driving matte black sports cars and bragging about his untouchable legacy. Victoria was too busy obsessing over expensive Persian rugs and torturing a frail old woman in a dark pantry. They had completely ignored the foundation of their own empire, and their profound ignorance had allowed the expiration clock to reach zero. Because the deadline had officially passed, the county no longer possessed any leasehold interest in the property. They had no legal authority to sell that land to Preston. His purchase deed was completely null and void. The millions of dollars his investors had poured into the development were entirely unsecured. The title insurance he purchased would instantly deny his massive claims due to gross, undeniable negligence on the part of his own research team. And the ultimate consequence of that expiration was a power shift so incredibly massive it defied comprehension. Under the strict mechanical enforcement of property law, every single thing constructed on those 500 acres automatically and irreversibly belonged to me. I slowly pushed myself up from the rotting floorboards of the farmhouse, my mind visualizing the sheer breathtaking magnitude of what I now possessed. I was no longer a discarded, underpaid records clerk freezing in an abandoned shack. I was the absolute, undisputed owner of Oakwood Heights. I closed my eyes and mentally walked through the sprawling development Victoria had relentlessly shoved in my face for the past 3 years. I pictured the massive custom-forged iron gates at the front entrance of the community. Those gates belonged to me. I pictured the 50,000-square-foot luxury country club with its imported marble floors, its private dining rooms, and its Olympic-sized swimming pools. That building belonged to me. I pictured the miles of perfectly paved suburban streets, the manicured green spaces, and the meticulously engineered subterranean utility grids. All of it belonged to me. But the most staggering realization of all was the houses. There were 200 sprawling multi-million-dollar luxury mansions sitting on that land. Victoria had spent the last 36 months aggressively marketing those exact properties. She had hosted lavish open houses, poured expensive champagne for wealthy buyers, and secured millions of dollars in advance commissions by selling those estates as the pinnacle of elite living. She had built her entire public identity around being the reigning queen of Oakwood Heights. She believed those houses were the ultimate proof of her absolute superiority over me. She did not own a single square inch of them. Every custom kitchen with imported Italian countertops, every sprawling master suite with panoramic windows, every crystal chandelier hanging in those grand foyers legally and undeniably belonged to Nolan, the pathetic husband she had just thrown into the rain. I owned the concrete. I owned the copper wiring hidden in the walls. I owned the imported oak hardwood floors. Every physical structure that Preston had violently drilled into my great-grandfather's dirt had immediately become my personal property the second the clock struck midnight 4 days ago. I opened my eyes and looked at my mother. Clara was still sitting in the dust-covered chair, her hands folded quietly in her lap, watching me with a calm, knowing expression. She had carried the heavy burden of this secret for decades, waiting patiently for the exact moment when the arrogant monsters of the world would finally overplay their hand. She knew that Victoria's horrific violence in the pantry was the final trigger. My mother had not sent me down into the dirt to find survival money. She had sent me down there to find a crown. Victoria had given me exactly 72 hours to respond to her cruel, fabricated medical conservatorship. She fully expected me to walk into the county courthouse on Monday morning as a broken, terrified, completely destitute man. She genuinely believed I would be forced to surrender my mother to a nightmarish state facility just to save myself from total ruin. She actually thought she held all the leverage because her name was on the deed to a single $2 million colonial house. She was completely oblivious to the fact that I was now holding the master deed to a $150 million empire. A dark, incredibly satisfying warmth spread through my chest, completely chasing away the freezing chill of the ruined farmhouse. For 5 years, Victoria had systematically stripped away my dignity, my confidence, and my voice. She had demanded total obedience and punished any sign of resistance with deep psychological cruelty. She had abused my frail mother simply because she felt entitled to inflict pain on anyone beneath her financial class. She thought she was an untouchable titan of industry. She was nothing but a temporary tenant who had just defaulted on her lease. I looked back down at the antique brass seal resting perfectly inside the rusted lockbox. I did not feel the need to scream or break things or call Victoria to angrily gloat over my discovery. True power does not need to announce its presence. True power moves in absolute silence until it is ready to consume everything in its path. I carefully wrapped the fragile legal ledgers in my damp suit jacket to protect them from the harsh elements of the decaying house. I placed the brass seal securely into my pocket. The fear of survival was completely gone. I knew exactly what my next move had to be. I was going to let Victoria continue to believe she had won the war. I was going to let her continue planning her lavish, incredibly expensive grand opening gala for Oakwood Heights. I was going to let her put on her designer dresses, pose for the local luxury magazines, and smile for the wealthy investors she worshipped so deeply. Because the higher she climbed up her pristine mountain of lies, the more devastating the impact would be when I finally presented the documents that proved she owned absolutely nothing. I was not just going to stop her from taking my mother. I was going to legally, financially, and publicly annihilate the entire foundation of her perfect life. The morning sun brought absolutely no warmth to the decaying farmhouse. I sat on the rotting floorboards long after the first light crept through the shattered windows. The ancient leather ledger rested heavily in my lap. A lesser man would have picked up his cell phone right then. A weaker man would have called his wife, screaming into the receiver, demanding apologies and threatening her with the undeniable proof of his newfound wealth. I did not touch my phone. I did not utter a single word. I simply looked at my mother, who was sleeping peacefully in the old wooden chair wrapped tightly in my damp suit jacket. I had spent my entire adult life reacting to Victoria and her brother. I had absorbed their insults, deflected their cruelty, and constantly played defense. That era was permanently over. True power is completely silent. It does not boast. It does not threaten. It simply executes. I carefully wrapped the fragile ledger and the heavy brass wax seal inside a plastic tarp I found in the ruined kitchen. I knew exactly what I held in my hands. It was the absolute destruction of Oakwood Heights. But possessing a weapon and knowing how to use it are two very different things. I needed an architect of corporate ruin. I left my mother with a trusted retired neighbor who lived a few miles down the highway, promising I would be back by nightfall. I spent my last $3 on a bus ticket into the heart of the city financial district. Working in the county records department for a decade gave me a unique, highly specific education. I knew every single real estate attorney in the metropolitan area. I knew who was corrupt, who was lazy, and who was lethal. Preston always bragged about his legal team, but I knew the one man Preston truly feared. His name was Harrison Caldwell. Harrison was a cutthroat, high-powered litigator who specialized in massive corporate land disputes. He did not play golf with city council members. He destroyed them in federal court. I walked into the soaring glass lobby of his firm wearing a wrinkled, damp suit. The receptionist looked at me like I was a vagrant and told me Harrison charged $1,000 an hour just for a consultation. I did not flinch. I placed my county employee badge on her pristine marble desk. I told her to tell Mr. Caldwell that the senior records clerk from the municipal archives was sitting in his lobby holding the original 1924 ground lease for Oakwood Heights. Less than 2 minutes later, I was sitting in a corner office on the 40th floor. Harrison Caldwell walked in. He was an older man with sharp eyes and a demeanor that completely lacked warmth. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, and told me I had exactly 3 minutes to explain why a suspended county clerk was taking up his valuable time. I did not waste a single second. I unrolled the plastic tarp and placed the brittle yellowed ledger directly on his desk. Next to it, I placed the heavy brass wax seal bearing my great-grandfather's initials. I laid out the entire situation with absolute clinical precision. I explained the discount title company Preston used, the ignored municipal tax exemptions, the unrecorded commercial ground lease, and the exact expiration date that had passed 4 days ago. I told him Victoria and Preston had built a $150 million luxury empire on top of dirt that legally belonged to my family. Harrison put on a pair of reading glasses. He leaned over the ancient ledger. The silence in the room stretched out for 10 agonizing minutes. I watched his eyes scan the meticulous cursive handwriting, the surveyor coordinates, and the municipal stamps. I watched a man who had seen every legal trick in the book slowly realize he was looking at the holy grail of real estate litigation. When he finally took off his glasses, his expression had completely transformed. The annoyance was gone. It was replaced by the terrifying, focused energy of a great white shark smelling blood in the water. He asked me what I wanted to do. I looked him dead in the eye. I told him I wanted to offer him a 30% contingency fee on a $150 million asset recovery. In exchange, I wanted Victoria and Preston stripped of every single thing they owned, and I wanted it done so quietly they would not hear the bullet until it had already passed through their heads. Harrison extended his hand across the desk. We had a deal. For the next 48 hours, his luxury corner office became a frantic, high-stakes war room. Harrison brought in his top 3 associate attorneys. They ordered food, locked the heavy glass doors, and went to work dissecting every single inch of the Oakwood Heights development. They verified my findings against the state property registry. The results were flawless. The documents were completely ironclad. Because the original ground lease had been executed prior to the modern municipal zoning acts, it carried a supreme jurisdictional weight that no local judge could simply wave away. Preston had built 200 luxury mansions on land that had officially legally reverted to my sole ownership. The first step in our silent war was completely removing my name from the direct line of fire. Victoria was aggressively pursuing a medical conservatorship to force my mother into a state ward and liquidate her assets. We needed to make sure there were absolutely no assets left for Victoria to steal. Harrison drafted an incredibly complex legal entity called an irrevocable family trust. Within a matter of hours, we legally transferred the deed to the ruined farmhouse, the surrounding 10 acres, and the massive reverted rights of the Oakwood Heights property directly into the trust. I was named the sole executing trustee with my mother as the primary beneficiary. The beauty of an irrevocable trust is that it forms an impenetrable legal fortress. Even if Victoria somehow bribed a judge into granting her the conservatorship, she could not touch the trust. The assets were locked away in a financial vault that her sleazy local lawyers could never breach. Once the fortress was built, Harrison launched the offensive. He did not file the paperwork in our local county courthouse. He knew Preston had powerful friends there who would immediately leak the information. Instead, Harrison utilized a brilliant procedural loophole, filing the quiet title actions in a neighboring federal district court, citing the interstate commerce implications of Preston's out-of-state investors. The filings were completely sealed under judicial review. We registered the reverted deeds with the State Land Authority, officially recording the transfer of all 200 mansions, the luxury country club, and the paved infrastructure into the name of my newly formed trust. The system updated silently in the background. The digital maps changed. The ownership records shifted. We conquered an entire luxury empire without firing a single audible shot. But simply owning the property on paper was not enough. I needed to cut off the lifeblood of their operation. Victoria and Preston functioned on an aggressive cash flow model. They required the constant influx of buyer capital to pay their contractors, service their massive commercial loans, and fund their extravagant lifestyles. Victoria had spent the last 3 years securing highly lucrative purchase contracts for the Oakwood Heights estates. Those wealthy buyers had deposited millions of dollars into rolling escrow accounts waiting for their final closing dates to take possession of their new mansions. Victoria treated those escrow accounts like her own personal treasury. I sat across from Harrison as he outlined the final, most devastating phase of our strategy. If we wanted to destroy them, we had to freeze the money. Harrison drafted a massive stack of legal notices known as lis pendens. A lis pendens is a formal, publicly recorded notice that a property is the subject of pending litigation. In the high-stakes world of luxury real estate, a lis pendens is an absolute kiss of death. The moment that notice hits a property title, no bank in the country will issue a mortgage. No title insurance company will underwrite the policy. The property becomes completely, utterly unsellable until the lawsuit is entirely resolved. Harrison deployed his associates to file a separate lis pendens on every single individual parcel within the Oakwood Heights subdivision. 200 separate legal strikes filed simultaneously across the state registry. The effect was instantaneous and completely invisible to the naked eye. The moment those notices were recorded, the title companies managing Victoria's luxury sales automatically froze the escrow accounts. The massive pools of buyer capital were instantly locked down by federal compliance algorithms. The millions of dollars Victoria was waiting to collect on closing day were suddenly trapped behind an impenetrable wall of legal red tape. The sheer brilliance of the blockade was its absolute silence. Victoria would not receive a dramatic phone call from a judge. Preston would not get a warning from his corrupt friends on the city council. They would simply wake up, go to work, and eventually try to access their funds, only to find the digital vault doors welded shut. We had effectively severed their financial jugular vein without them even feeling the blade. I sat in the plush leather chair of Harrison's office, looking out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city skyline below. I thought about the ruined farmhouse where my mother was waiting. I thought about the freezing rain, the empty bank accounts, and the absolute terror I had felt just 48 hours ago. Victoria had tried to bury me in the dirt. She had used her wealth as a weapon to strip me of my dignity and my family. She thought her money made her invincible. But as I watched the city lights flicker in the distance, I knew the truth. Victoria was currently living in a house of cards, and I had just quietly removed the table it was sitting on. The traps were perfectly set. The legal web was tightly woven. The financial blockade was absolute. I did not need to scream or threaten or beg for mercy. I just had to wait for the grand opening gala. I had to wait for the exact moment when she stood in front of the entire world wearing her expensive dresses and flashing her perfect smile to let the hammer fall. The quiet phase of the war was over. The absolute nightmare she had earned was finally ready to begin. While my legal team was silently weaving a flawless, inescapable net across the federal court system, Victoria was busy putting on the most extravagant public performance of her entire life. I would later learn every single agonizing detail of how she spent those final days pieced together from the digital trails she left behind, the social media broadcasts she flaunted, and the testimonies of the mutual acquaintances who watched her parade around the city. She was riding a massive euphoric high. She truly believed she had orchestrated the perfect crime. She had discarded a useless husband, neutralized a burdensome mother-in-law, and secured total control of a luxury real estate empire. In her mind, she was utterly untouchable. Her victory lap officially began on a bright Wednesday morning, less than a week after she threw my mother and me out into the freezing rain. Victoria had booked a massive multi-page feature spread in a highly exclusive local lifestyle publication called Elite Valley Magazine. The focus of the article was supposedly on female empowerment in the cutthroat world of commercial real estate development. In reality, it was a paid vanity project designed entirely to stroke her own massive ego. I saw the digital proof of the magazine cover when a sympathetic former co-worker texted a screenshot to my new prepaid burner phone. Victoria was posing in the grand imported marble foyer of our $2 million suburban colonial. She was wearing a flawless white designer suit, leaning casually against the sweeping mahogany staircase. Her hair and makeup were completely immaculate, styled by a professional team she had hired just for the morning shoot. The headline, printed in bold gold lettering across the bottom of the cover, read, "Building a Legacy on a Foundation of Integrity." The sheer breathtaking hypocrisy of that title actually made me laugh out loud in the cold, dusty kitchen of the farmhouse. The article inside was even worse. Victoria spun a beautiful, inspiring narrative for the naive journalist. She claimed that her unprecedented success in selling the Oakwood Heights subdivision was the direct result of her unwavering family values and her deep commitment to the community. She spoke at length about how challenging it was to balance her high-powered career with her personal life, subtly implying that she had been forced to make difficult, heartbreaking sacrifices to protect her peace. She never explicitly mentioned my name, but the underlying narrative was incredibly clear to anyone in our social circle. She was painting herself as a brave, independent woman who had finally freed herself from a toxic, unsupportive deadweight. But a glossy magazine cover was not enough to satisfy her desperate need for public validation. Victoria wanted a coronation. She wanted the entire city to physically witness her triumph. She and Preston were organizing the official grand opening gala for the Oakwood Heights luxury subdivision. It was scheduled for that upcoming Saturday evening, intended to serve as a massive self-congratulatory party for themselves and their wealthy investors. Because they assumed the massive pools of buyer escrow funds were safely secured and ready to be dispersed, they completely ignored any semblance of a budget. Victoria authorized the expenditure of over $100,000 for a single night of entertainment. She hired a premier event planning firm to transform the newly constructed 50,000-square-foot community clubhouse into an absolute palace. Massive, clear-topped luxury tents were erected across the pristine, freshly manicured lawns. Fleets of private catering trucks rolled into the neighborhood, bringing in raw oyster bars, imported caviar, and endless cases of vintage French champagne. She commissioned a renowned local string quartet to play on the outdoor terrace and arranged for a spectacular choreographed fireworks display to light up the night sky right as she delivered her keynote speech. She was treating the unearned escrow money like an endless, overflowing fountain. She was carelessly spending the capital of the exact same home buyers whose financial accounts my lawyers had just legally frozen. Her total immersion in this fabricated reality made her entirely blind to the actual world crumbling around her. Victoria operated on the arrogant assumption that danger only came from people with money and status. Because she believed I had neither, she completely lowered her defenses. That lethal arrogance was perfectly demonstrated on a Thursday afternoon just 48 hours before the grand opening gala. Victoria was sitting at the massive quartz island in the kitchen of her colonial home, drinking a sparkling mimosa, while a private manicurist painted her nails. Her housekeeper walked into the room and placed a stack of Daily Mail on the counter. Mixed in with the heavy, glossy fashion catalogs and the premium invitations was a single, unremarkable envelope. It was printed on cheap standard-issue county government paper. Victoria casually sliced the envelope open with a silver letter opener. She pulled out a densely worded, multi-page legal document. It was the official state-mandated notification of a lis pendens filing against her primary commercial assets. It was the absolute, undeniable proof that a catastrophic legal action had just been initiated against the entirety of Oakwood Heights. The document was filled with the exact, archaic property law terminology I had spent a decade mastering in the county basement. It referenced quiet title actions, reversionary interests, and the immediate suspension of commercial escrow transfers. Victoria stared at the cheap paper, her eyes scanning the paragraphs of dense municipal code. She did not understand a single word of it. In her world of luxury, sales contracts were streamlined, modernized, and handed to her by closing attorneys who translated the boring details. She had never actually taken the time to understand the structural foundation of property law. Instead of recognizing the document as an active ticking bomb, Victoria simply felt annoyed by the bureaucratic inconvenience. She took a photograph of the first page with her phone and texted the image directly to Preston. Preston was currently sitting in the private wood-paneled smoking lounge of his exclusive country club. He was sharing an incredibly expensive bottle of aged scotch with the exact same 3 out-of-state investors who had attended the disastrous dinner party. They were celebrating their impending payday. Preston looked at his phone, squinting through the thick cigar smoke at the image his sister had just sent. Like Victoria, Preston was a creature of aggressive momentum, not meticulous detail. He saw the official county seal at the top of the letter, recognized a few generic legal terms regarding property assessments, and immediately dismissed the entire thing. He typed out a quick, careless reply to his sister telling her to throw the notice in the trash. He assured her it was just a delayed, automated clerical notice regarding a routine municipal tax reassessment triggered by their new construction. He promised he would have one of his junior legal aides call the city planning office on Monday to clear up the red tape. He told Victoria to stop worrying about boring county paperwork and focus entirely on making sure the champagne was properly chilled for Saturday night. Victoria read the text, smiled, and tossed the official legal warning directly into the kitchen garbage can. She went back to drinking her mimosa and discussing floral arrangements with her manicurist. She had just held the instrument of her own financial execution in her bare hands, and her sheer monumental arrogance allowed her to throw it away without a second thought. Back at the country club, Preston locked his phone and leaned back into his plush leather armchair. He raised his crystal glass of scotch, the amber liquid catching the warm light of the room. He felt completely invincible. He had successfully manipulated the local zoning board, bulldozed over a massive stretch of prime real estate, and sold the illusion of exclusivity for tens of millions of dollars. One of the older investors, a man who had helped finance the initial grading of the subdivision, casually asked Preston if there had been any further issues with his unstable brother-in-law. The investor referenced the dinner party, asking if the police had managed to keep me away from their lucrative operation. Preston let out a booming, theatrical laugh. He took a slow puff of his cigar, blowing the thick white smoke toward the ceiling. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and proceeded to mock my existence with absolute unbridled cruelty. He told the investors that I was a completely neutralized threat. He bragged about how easily he had weaponized his relationship with the county commissioner to strip me of my miserable government salary. He described me as a weak, spineless parasite who had finally been scraped off the bottom of his sister's expensive shoes. He assured the wealthy men at the table that I was currently starving in a freezing, rotting farmhouse on the absolute edge of the county, entirely incapable of fighting back. Preston explicitly stated that men like me were naturally designed to be crushed by men like him. He said the world operated on a strict biological hierarchy of power, and that removing me from Victoria's life was simply a necessary act of commercial sanitation. He raised his glass again, proposing a toast to the natural order of things. The investors laughed heartily, clinking their heavy crystal glasses together, absolutely secure in their belief that they were the apex predators of the city. They had absolutely no idea that their massive commercial loans had just been permanently defaulted. They had no idea that their vast pools of liquid capital were currently trapped in a frozen escrow account that no judge in the state would unlock. They sat in their expensive suits, drinking their expensive liquor, completely oblivious to the fact that they had just financed the construction of 200 luxury mansions on land that legally belonged to the man they were currently laughing at. As Friday evening rolled into Saturday morning, the illusion of Victoria's triumph reached its absolute peak. She spent the entire day undergoing an intensive regimen of luxury spa treatments, professional hairstyling, and high-end makeup application. She slipped into a custom-tailored floor-length designer gown that cost more than my entire annual salary at the county records office. She stood in front of the massive gilded mirror in the master bedroom of the colonial house, admiring her own reflection. She saw a self-made queen. She saw a woman who had conquered the real estate market through sheer force of will and superior intellect. She looked at her sparkling diamond jewelry and felt a deep, profound sense of vindication. She genuinely believed that throwing my frail mother against a pantry wall and framing me for domestic violence were completely justified actions. In her twisted moral calculus, she had simply protected her empire from the weak people who threatened to slow her down. She was perfectly ready to step out onto the grand stage and accept the applause of her wealthy peers. Miles away on the desolate, wind-swept edge of the county limit, I was standing on the rotting wooden porch of the old farmhouse. The freezing October air bit at my face, but I barely registered the temperature. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the barren fields. I was wearing my best suit, the only one I had managed to grab before the police forced me out of my home. It was slightly wrinkled and smelled faintly of the damp cabin, but it did not matter. I looked down at the pristine, heavy leather briefcase resting in my hand. Inside was the original 1924 commercial ground lease, the antique brass wax seal belonging to my great-grandfather, and a massive stack of federal court injunctions formally declaring my absolute ownership of the Oakwood Heights subdivision. I watched the distant sky above the valley slowly darken. I knew that right at this exact moment, Victoria was stepping into a chauffeured town car, preparing to make her grand entrance. I knew the caterers were lighting the outdoor heating lamps and pouring the first rounds of vintage champagne. I knew Preston was shaking hands and slapping backs, fully prepared to claim his massive victory. They had spent the entire week celebrating my total destruction. They had thrown a party on the deck of a sinking ship. I picked up the briefcase and walked down the muddy driveway toward the idling sedan my lawyer had sent to collect me. The silent, meticulous, agonizing work was finally finished. The legal foundation was flawlessly set. The financial trap had been completely sprung. Now there was absolutely nothing left to do but walk into the blinding lights of their massive $100,000 gala, look the monsters directly in the eyes, and tear their beautiful, expensive world to absolute shreds. The grand ballroom of the Oakwood Heights Country Club was a breathtaking monument to stolen money. Every single detail of the grand opening gala had been meticulously designed to project an image of absolute, untouchable wealth. Towering ice sculptures carved into the shapes of soaring eagles flanked the imported mahogany entrance doors. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated through the massive crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with raw oysters and crystal flutes of vintage French champagne. The room smelled of expensive perfume, fresh-cut orchids, and the intoxicating scent of newly minted luxury. Victoria stood at the absolute epicenter of the room, completely radiant in her element. She was wearing a custom-tailored floor-length silver gown that caught the light of the massive crystal chandeliers overhead. Her hair was swept up in a flawless, elegant style, and her neck was adorned with a staggering diamond necklace that Preston had gifted her for closing the pre-sales. She looked exactly like the reigning queen of a kingdom she believed she had built with her own two hands. She laughed musically at a joke told by the city mayor, touching his arm lightly, playing the role of the gracious, powerful hostess to absolute perfection. Preston was holding court near the private bar, surrounded by the wealthy out-of-state investors who had financed the grading and construction of the massive subdivision. He was smoking an imported cigar, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride, loudly taking credit for transforming a forgotten stretch of barren dirt into the most exclusive residential zip code in the state. The investors patted him on the back, completely unaware that their massive capital contributions were currently trapped in a federally frozen escrow nightmare. At exactly 8 o'clock, the gentle classical music from the live string quartet faded away. The heavy velvet curtains near the front stage were drawn back. A polished event coordinator tapped a microphone, asking the distinguished guests to direct their attention to the center podium. The crowd of local politicians, wealthy buyers, and corporate elites fell into a polite, anticipatory silence. Victoria glided up the carpeted steps to the stage. The spotlight followed her, illuminating her triumphant smile. She gripped the edges of the wooden podium and looked out over the sea of wealthy faces. This was the moment she had craved for her entire life. This was the public coronation she had violently cleared the path to achieve. She leaned into the microphone. Her voice echoed through the state-of-the-art sound system, smooth and practiced. She thanked the mayor for his unwavering support of commercial development. She thanked her brother Preston for his unparalleled visionary genius. Then she adopted a tone of deep, fabricated humility. She spoke about the long, exhausting journey it took to bring Oakwood Heights from a simple dream to a magnificent reality. She told the crowd that true success required making agonizing personal sacrifices, cutting away the negative influences in life, and fiercely protecting your peace. The subtle, venomous implication was perfectly clear to anyone who knew our history. She was publicly celebrating the fact that she had thrown her useless husband and his sick mother into the freezing rain. She raised her crystal glass of champagne high into the air. She proudly welcomed the 200 new homeowners to the most elite, secure, and beautiful community in the country. Before a single person in the crowd could raise their glass in return, the massive imported mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom were violently pushed open. The heavy doors hit the interior walls with a loud, echoing boom that completely shattered the polite atmosphere of the gala. The sound was so jarring that several guests gasped and physically stepped back. I walked into the blinding light of the ballroom. I was not wearing a $5,000 Italian suit like Preston. I was wearing the exact same wrinkled, damp suit I had worn on the night Victoria locked me out of my own house. But I was not the same terrified, broken county clerk she had discarded. I walked with my head held high, my shoulders squared, carrying the antique brass wax seal in my pocket and the absolute certainty of her destruction in my mind. I was not alone. Flanking my right side was Harrison Caldwell, the most lethal, high-powered real estate litigator in the metropolitan area. He carried a thick leather briefcase and wore an expression of terrifying clinical calm. Flanking my left side and trailing just a few steps behind us were two fully uniformed United States federal marshals. The heavy tactical gear worn beneath their dark windbreakers and the prominent silver badges clipped to their belts radiated an undeniable, overwhelming authority. The entire ballroom went completely dead silent. The string quartet, who had just begun to play a celebratory chord, abruptly stopped mid-bow. The only sound in the massive room was the heavy rhythmic thud of our shoes walking straight down the center aisle of the crowd. The private security guards hired by Victoria to patrol the event immediately stepped forward to intercept us. They were large men in black suits trained to quickly remove unwanted guests. But the moment they saw the federal badges on the marshals, they froze. One of the marshals simply shook his head and raised a single hand. The private guards instantly backed away, pressing themselves against the walls, completely refusing to interfere with federal law enforcement. The crowd of wealthy elites parted before us like the Red Sea. I saw the faces of the 3 out-of-state investors who had been sitting in my dining room a week ago. Their arrogant, dismissive smiles vanished, replaced by looks of total confusion and creeping alarm. They recognized me immediately as the pathetic husband they had laughed at, but they could not comprehend why I was currently marching toward the stage with federal agents. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Victoria. She was standing frozen behind the wooden podium. The triumphant smile had completely melted off her face. The crystal champagne flute in her hand was trembling so violently that the expensive liquid was spilling over the rim and dripping onto the stage floor. Her mind frantically scrambled to process the impossible image in front of her. She could not fathom how a penniless man with no resources had managed to infiltrate her highly secure $100,000 private event. When we reached the base of the stage, Victoria's survival instincts finally kicked in. She reverted immediately to the exact same theatrical tactic that had worked so flawlessly with the local police. She gripped the microphone and let out a sharp, trembling gasp. She pointed a shaking finger directly at my chest. She screamed into the microphone, her voice echoing through the massive speakers, claiming that I was a deranged, violent stalker. She cried out to the crowd, begging someone to help her, playing the role of the terrified, battered woman whose abusive husband had tracked her down. She ordered the security guards to arrest me, sobbing loudly that I was a direct threat to her life and the safety of everyone in the room. It was a brilliant performance, completely identical to the one she delivered in our hallway. But this time it failed spectacularly. The federal marshals did not draw their weapons. They did not rush forward to tackle me. They simply stepped up to the edge of the stage, positioned themselves firmly between me and the crowd, and completely ignored her hysterical screaming. The room watched in stunned silence as the highest level of law enforcement in the country stood guard to protect my right to speak. Preston realized the victim routine was failing. He slammed his scotch glass onto a nearby table and charged toward the stage. His face was flushed crimson with absolute fury. He tried to physically block my path, puffing out his chest, completely enraged that his perfect night was being ruined by a man he viewed as an insect. He demanded to know what the hell was going on. He shouted at Harrison Caldwell, threatening to have him disbarred, screaming that they were trespassing on private, highly secure property. Harrison Caldwell did not even blink. He stepped smoothly in front of me, completely cutting off Preston's aggressive advance. Harrison calmly unlatched his heavy leather briefcase. He pulled out a massive, densely packed stack of federal court injunctions stamped with the unmistakable seals of a United States district judge. Harrison pressed the thick stack of legal documents directly into Preston's chest, forcing the arrogant developer to instinctively grab them or let them fall to the floor. Harrison spoke with a voice so cold and authoritative it commanded the attention of the entire ballroom. He informed Preston that those documents contained multiple federal injunctions, quiet title judgments, and formal notices of lis pendens. He stated clearly, making sure the investors in the front row could hear every single syllable, that Preston's fraudulent purchase of the Oakwood Heights parcel was legally null and void. He announced that the 100-year commercial ground lease had officially expired and that the title company Preston used was currently under investigation for gross negligence. Preston looked down at the federal injunctions in his hands. He read the bold black lettering at the top of the first page. The aggressive, bullying posture completely collapsed. His broad shoulders slumped forward and all the color instantly drained from his face. He looked exactly like a man who had just stepped off a cliff in the dark. He slowly looked up at me, his eyes wide with a horrific, dawning realization. He finally understood that the dirt beneath his feet did not belong to the city. Victoria was still standing behind the microphone on the stage. She was no longer crying. The fake hysteria had burned away, replaced by an absolute suffocating panic. She stared at her brother, waiting for him to tear up the papers, waiting for him to assert his power and throw me out into the rain like he always did. But Preston just stood there, paralyzed, holding the evidence of his own catastrophic destruction. I walked past Preston. I climbed the short carpeted stairs onto the stage. Victoria instinctively backed away from the podium, taking small, trembling steps until she was trapped against the heavy velvet curtain. She clutched her diamond necklace, staring at me as if I was a ghost who had clawed his way out of a grave she had personally dug. I stepped up to the wooden podium. I looked out over the massive crowd of terrified investors, confused politicians, and horrified homebuyers. I looked at the 200 people who had given my wife their life savings based on an absolute lie. Then I turned my head and looked directly into Victoria's eyes. I remembered the brutal way she had shoved my frail mother against the pantry shelves. I remembered the vile, venomous whisper she used when she threatened to lock Clara in a state ward. I remembered the smirk on her face when she locked the heavy front door and left us shivering in the freezing rain. I reached into my suit pocket. I pulled out the antique brass wax seal belonging to my great-grandfather. I set it down on the wooden podium right next to the microphone. The heavy metal made a solid, echoing thud. I leaned toward the microphone, ensuring my voice would be heard by every single person in the grand ballroom. I kept my tone perfectly calm, devoid of the frantic anger she always tried to provoke out of me. I told her the game was completely over. "You can't sell these houses, Victoria. You don't own them. I do." Harrison Caldwell did not wait for Victoria to finish gasping for breath. He signaled to one of his junior associates who had quietly slipped over to the audio-visual control board at the side of the stage. A second later, the massive digital projection screen behind the podium flickered to life. The glamorous promotional slideshow of Oakwood Heights vanished instantly. In its place, projected 30 feet high for every single wealthy investor and local politician to see, was the high-resolution scan of the 1924 commercial ground lease. The heavy cursive handwriting and the deeply indented brass wax seal of my great-grandfather loomed over the entire ballroom like a massive, undeniable death warrant. Caldwell reached out and effortlessly pulled the microphone away from Victoria. His voice boomed through the state-of-the-art sound system, completely drowning out the scattered, confused whispers of the crowd. He narrated the exact legal reality of the document displayed on the screen behind him. He pointed out the specific geographical coordinates written in the old ledger, while his associate simultaneously superimposed a digital overlay of the lease boundaries directly on top of the master blueprint for Oakwood Heights. It was a flawless, irrefutable match. The bright red lines of my family property perfectly enclosed every single luxury mansion, every paved road, and the very country club we were currently standing inside. Caldwell explained the expiration date to the silent room. He explained the strict reversionary clause. He stated with absolute lethal clarity that the local county had zero legal authority to sell the land to anyone. He informed the crowd that every single deed of sale executed by Preston and Victoria was fundamentally fraudulent. The silence in the grand ballroom lasted for exactly 5 seconds before the brutal reality finally set in. The quiet crowd of elite guests suddenly erupted into absolute uncontrolled panic. The low murmur swelled into a deafening roar of outrage and terror. Wealthy buyers who had already transferred millions of dollars in down payments began shouting, demanding to know where their money was. Local politicians who had attached their names to the project immediately started backing away toward the exits, desperate to put as much physical distance between themselves and the scandal as possible. I kept my eyes entirely fixed on Preston. The booming, arrogant developer who had mocked my existence just a few days ago was physically breaking apart in real time. His pristine custom suit suddenly looked like a cheap costume. Caldwell walked directly up to him and handed him a separate, much thinner legal folder. Caldwell did not need the microphone for this conversation. He spoke directly into Preston's face, his tone dripping with professional, absolute disdain. Caldwell explained the specific statutes regarding commercial title insurance policies. Title insurance protects developers against hidden defects, but it absolutely, completely voids itself in the event of gross, willful negligence. By utilizing a discount title company, bypassing the physical municipal archives, and relying entirely on a lazy digital tax exemption to expedite the land purchase, Preston had violated the core underwriting terms of his massive policy. Caldwell smiled a cold, shark-like smile. He told Preston that the insurance company was completely off the hook. The financial liability for the $150 million development rested solely on Preston's personal shoulders. I watched the arrogant titan of industry physically shrink. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His knees buckled slightly, and he blindly reached out, grabbing the edge of a nearby catering table just to keep from collapsing onto the imported marble floor. He tried to form a sentence, but his mouth just opened and closed in silent, suffocating horror. The math was doing its work in his brain. He did not just lose a project. He owed $150 million for houses he built on stolen dirt. He was financially annihilated. The 3 out-of-state investors who had funded the early construction phases did not hesitate to turn on him. They did not ask Preston for an explanation. They did not offer him a single shred of loyalty. They immediately pulled out their cell phones right there in the middle of the ballroom, barking frantic orders to their corporate legal teams to freeze all remaining capital and initiate immediate asset seizure protocols against Preston's personal holdings. The representatives from the commercial lending banks who had happily drank Victoria's vintage champagne just 10 minutes ago were practically sprinting toward the exit doors to initiate emergency loan recall procedures. The financial blood was instantly draining from the room. The federal marshals flanking me finally stepped forward into the chaos. They were not there to arrest me for a fabricated domestic dispute. They were there because selling 200 luxury homes on land you do not own across state lines to wealthy buyers constitutes massive systemic federal wire fraud. One of the marshals approached the catering table where Preston was hyperventilating. The marshal did not read him his rights yet, but he firmly and loudly requested that Preston surrender his passport immediately and prepare for an extensive custodial interview regarding the fraudulent escrow accounts. Preston looked wildly around the room, his eyes wide and completely empty, frantically searching the crowd for the powerful local politicians he had bribed. He was looking for the county commissioner or the mayor to step in and save him. But the elite friends he had bragged about were already gone. They had abandoned the sinking ship the very second the word fraud echoed through the sound system. Preston was entirely alone with the federal agents. The luxurious grand opening gala devolved into a spectacular catastrophic stampede. The event planners realized they were never going to be paid, so they immediately stopped serving food and began packing their equipment. The string quartet had already fled the terrace. Guests pushed past each other to reach the valet parking, desperate to escape the toxic fallout of the ballroom. Waiters abandoned their silver trays on empty tables. In less than 20 minutes, the packed, vibrant celebration emptied out completely. The massive room became a vast, echoing cavern scattered with half-empty champagne flutes, discarded hors d'oeuvres, and the absolute ruin of an empire. Victoria had not moved a single inch. She stood absolutely paralyzed on the stage, completely isolated under the bright, harsh spotlight. She watched the wealthy elite she worshipped abandon her with breathtaking speed. She watched the federal marshals quietly escort her completely broken brother out of the side doors of the country club. She realized with terrifying clarity that she had absolutely nothing left. She had no powerful brother to protect her, no massive bank accounts to shield her, and no social status left to leverage. The majestic silver designer gown she wore suddenly looked ridiculous. The heavy diamond necklace sparkled brightly against her skin, a cruel reminder of the wealth that had just evaporated into thin air. I slowly walked up the steps and stood on the stage beside her. The massive digital projection of my great-grandfather's deed still glowed brightly on the screen behind us, casting long shadows across the empty ballroom floor. Victoria finally turned to look at me. The arrogant, untouchable monster who had shoved my mother into a wall and locked me in the freezing rain was completely gone. The pivot was immediate and pathetic. Her eyes filled with rapid, desperate tears. Her breathing became jagged and heavy. She tried to deploy the exact same theatrical weeping she had used on the police officers in our hallway. Her knees gave out. She collapsed onto the stage right in front of me. The heavy fabric of her expensive gown pooled around her on the wooden floor. She reached up with trembling hands and tightly grabbed the bottom edge of my damp, wrinkled suit coat. She looked up at my face, the tears actively ruining her immaculate professional makeup, creating dark, messy streaks down her pale cheeks. She started begging. Her voice was a frantic, pathetic whisper. She begged for my forgiveness, swearing that the stress of the real estate market had temporarily driven her insane. She promised me she would immediately drop the fabricated medical conservatorship. She swore she would never threaten Clara again. She pleaded with me to let her come home, promising that she would hire the best private nurses in the state and treat my mother like absolute royalty for the rest of her natural life. She cried that we were husband and wife, that we had built a life together, and that I could not just destroy her over a simple mistake. I looked down at the woman gripping my coat. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the fiery, uncontrolled rage she always tried to provoke. I felt nothing but absolute freezing clarity. I realized she was not crying because she felt genuine remorse for hurting my mother. She was crying because she had just lost her money, and she was desperately trying to attach herself to the only person left in the room who actually possessed true power. I reached down and gently but firmly pried her perfectly manicured fingers off the fabric of my coat. I stepped back, severing the physical connection completely. I looked at her tear-stained face, remembering the cold, soulless smirk she gave me when she slammed the heavy oak door in my face. I leaned down slightly, bringing my face just inches from hers, exactly the way she had leaned into my mother in the dark pantry. I looked directly into her terrified eyes and softly whispered the exact same venomous words she had used to seal her own fate. "No one will believe you." I stood back up, turned my back on her entirely, and walked slowly down the stairs of the stage. My shoes echoed loudly against the imported marble floors as I walked through the empty, magnificent ballroom. I left her completely alone, sobbing uncontrollably on the floor of a spectacular 50,000-square-foot luxury building that she had proudly designed and built, but that I permanently owned. The Monday morning following the ruined grand opening gala did not bring a simple hangover for Preston. It brought a highly coordinated, devastating raid by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Preston had spent his entire adult life believing that his vast wealth made him completely immune to the consequences of his own actions. He thought he could casually bypass centuries of established property law just because he played golf with a county commissioner and bribed a few local politicians. He was spectacularly wrong. Dozens of armed federal agents marched into his sleek downtown corporate office before he even had a chance to pour his first cup of morning coffee. They carried heavy cardboard boxes and aggressively seized every single hard drive filing cabinet and physical contract in the building. Preston was physically escorted out of his beautiful glass lobby in heavy steel handcuffs, while his terrified employees watched in absolute silence. The trial that followed was a masterful demonstration of swift, unforgiving justice. Because Preston had knowingly authorized the sale of luxury properties across state lines, without holding a valid, unencumbered title to the land, the federal prosecutors charged him with multiple counts of wire fraud and massive interstate real estate fraud. The powerful local politicians he used to rely on scattered immediately. The mayor and the city council members publicly distanced themselves from his toxic brand, treating him like a complete pariah to save their own careers. Sitting in the massive federal courtroom, Preston looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant titan of industry who had openly mocked my existence in the country club. His custom Italian suits were replaced by standard-issue detention clothing. His confident, booming voice was reduced to a pathetic, trembling whisper as the federal judge delivered his sentence. Preston was handed a mandatory 10 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the slightest possibility of early parole. His massive development company was completely dissolved, and his personal assets were aggressively seized to pay back a tiny fraction of the hundreds of millions of dollars he had stolen from his out-of-state investors. The man who built a sprawling empire on arrogance and lies was finally locked inside a cold concrete box built on absolute truth. Victoria experienced an even more spectacular and agonizing descent because she had so much further to fall. Her entire identity was woven directly into the fabric of the local luxury elite. She derived her entire sense of self-worth from her perceived superiority over everyone else. When the Oakwood Heights scandal exploded across the regional news networks, her pristine public reputation was instantly incinerated. The extremely wealthy clients she had spent years aggressively courting completely turned on her with a vicious, predatory rage. They filed dozens of aggressive civil lawsuits against her, accusing her of gross professional misrepresentation, massive breach of fiduciary duty, and outright fraud. The State Real Estate Commission launched an immediate, exhaustive investigation into her shady business practices and permanently revoked her broker license. She was legally barred from ever selling property in the state again. The financial consequences hit her like a relentless, crushing avalanche. The massive legal fees required to defend herself against the army of angry investors completely drained whatever hidden offshore funds she had managed to steal from our joint accounts. The bank swiftly foreclosed on her precious $2 million suburban colonial home. I actually drove past the property on the day of her formal eviction. I parked my car across the street and watched in absolute silence as a team of court-appointed movers carried her expensive custom furniture, her imported rugs, and her designer clothes out onto the front lawn. Victoria stood on the driveway clutching a cheap cardboard box, looking completely hollowed out and utterly defeated. With her legal debts soaring into the millions, she was forced to file for total personal bankruptcy, completely surrendering every single luxury item she had ever accumulated. Today, the woman who used to drink expensive vintage champagne and laugh at my meager government salary wakes up every morning at 5 o'clock to ride a crowded public bus to a massive discount retail store on the dreary industrial edge of the city. She wears a cheap, scratchy polyester uniform and a plastic name tag. She spends 8 agonizing hours a day standing on her aching feet, folding discounted sweaters and listening to angry customers complain about expired coupons. Her manager is a 22-year-old kid who routinely yells at her for taking too long on her 15-minute lunch breaks. She earns a basic minimum hourly wage, and the court automatically garnishes 70% of every single paycheck she earns to slowly pay down her monumental legal restitutions. She rents a tiny windowless studio apartment situated over a noisy laundromat. There are no more private caterers. There are no more glowing magazine covers. There is only the grueling, exhausting reality of the working-class life she used to so viciously despise. She is trapped in a permanent cycle of manual labor and endless debt, completely erased from the high society she sacrificed her own soul to conquer. While Victoria and Preston were completely swallowed by the terrifying consequences of their own boundless greed, I was busy executing the final triumphant phase of my great-grandfather's masterful vision. I had absolutely no desire to become a controversial commercial landlord managing 200 angry, litigious millionaires who had just purchased homes on my property. I preferred a much cleaner, more permanent financial solution. Utilizing the unmatched expertise of Harrison Caldwell, I entered into intensive, highly secretive negotiations with a massive national real estate conglomerate. They fully understood the absolute ironclad nature of my reverted deed, and they possessed the massive liquid capital required to instantly legitimize the neighborhood and settle the outstanding buyer disputes. I sold them exactly half of the Oakwood Heights residential development and the entire luxury country club in a single sweeping transaction. The settlement wire transfer deposited an absolutely staggering sum of generational wealth directly into our irrevocable family trust. I sat in a sleek corporate boardroom overlooking the city, drinking premium coffee, while a team of executives treated me with absolute respect and deference. I retained full unencumbered ownership of the remaining 100 luxury mansions, transforming them into premium rental estates that generate a massive permanent stream of passive income every single month. I never have to set foot in a dusty county records basement ever again. The financial security is so absolute and so vast that my family will never experience a single moment of economic panic for the next 5 generations. But the money itself meant absolutely nothing to me compared to what it finally allowed me to do for my mother. Clara had spent her entire life sacrificing her own comfort so I could survive. She had endured the absolute worst of Victoria's physical and emotional abuse simply because she did not want to be a financial burden. I made a quiet vow on the floor of that freezing, rotting farmhouse that she would never experience another second of fear or discomfort as long as she lived. I kept that promise. I purchased a spectacular single-story private estate situated on 50 acres of pristine rolling green hills, completely isolated from the noise and pollution of the city. I hired a brilliant team of specialized residential architects and premium medical contractors to transform the entire east wing of the massive house into a private state-of-the-art medical and recovery suite. It looks exactly like a luxury penthouse in a 5-star wellness resort, complete with massive panoramic windows that overlook a beautiful blooming botanical garden and a heated therapeutic hydrotherapy pool. Clara sleeps on the softest imported linens. She has a private chef who prepares customized, highly nutritious meals tailored exactly to her tastes. Most importantly, she has a highly trained team of dedicated, compassionate private nurses available around the clock to monitor her health and assist with her daily physical therapy. There are no more dark, terrifying pantries. There are no more whispered threats. My mother is treated with the absolute dignity, respect, and reverence of a true queen. We spend our evenings sitting together on the wide back patio, drinking warm chamomile tea and watching the sun set behind the distant hills. Her physical strength has vastly improved, and her mobility returns a little more each day. But more importantly, the bright, joyful light has completely returned to her eyes. She knows she is entirely safe. She knows the monsters are permanently gone. Sometimes I sit alone in my quiet, wood-paneled study and reflect on the absolute insanity of the past year. I think about the profound arrogance of people who believe that accumulating wealth somehow elevates them above the basic rules of human decency. Victoria and Preston were so completely blinded by their own greed and their desperate pursuit of superficial status that they forgot to look down. They built a magnificent shimmering castle in the sky, but they constructed it entirely on a bed of lies. They thought they could step on the foundation to reach the crown without realizing who owned the ground beneath their feet. My great-grandfather understood a profound truth that took me 38 years to fully comprehend. Real power does not need to roar. It does not need to show off designer clothes, drive expensive sports cars, or violently intimidate frail old women. Real power is completely silent. It is incredibly patient. It waits quietly in the dark, buried deep in the historical dirt until the absolute perfect moment to strike. Victoria spent 5 years trying to convince me that I was a worthless, pathetic loser. She handed me all the pain, the humiliation, and the suffering a man could possibly endure. But in the end, her cruelty simply forced me to dig deep enough to find the one weapon that could permanently destroy her. If you believe that karma always collects its debts, hit the like button and share this story with someone who needs a reminder that the truth always wins in the end. Leave a comment below. Have you ever watched an arrogant person dig their own grave? Subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice, family secrets, and ultimate revenge.